Simmons and I had a conversation at Spring Place in Beverly Hills in front of a live audience. Using chalk as his main medium, Simmons utilizes the traces and ghost-like effects of chalk to portray compelling messages involving racial stereotypes. Throughout our conversation, we touched on his athletic past, the intricacies of his 50-foot mural at the Dallas Cowboy Stadium, and why he helped dig a trench for Robert Irwin, among other compelling tales of his youth. I think about sports in relationship to your work, and I thought that would be a good place to start talking.
Yeah, it's a perfect place. Yeah.
Great.
First of all, thank you all for coming. Appreciate being here. Yeah, sports. Sports has been a large part of my background for as long as I can remember. I was raised to be a professional baseball player and trained doing that for a long time. And I think that kind of set the foundation for me to, be able to work in the field, no pun intended, in the field of art, in that there's a lot of alone time and a lot of sort of dedication and focus that you have to bring to your sport. I think you do that, you bring that to the studio. And probably the biggest difference being is that on the field, I think you have, you have stats, you have numbers that can show your production. And in the art game, I think it's a little different, the rules of the game are a little different. Yeah.
So it's so interesting because I've talked to a lot of artists and athletes, and another thing that the two have in common is the idea of practice,
yep.
Right? And repetition. And I hadn't really thought about the alone time, though. So that's fascinating. So I want to come back to the idea of practice, but I want to ask a little bit or talk a little bit about the alone time. So what does it feel like to be by yourself?
Well, I think one of the interesting things is that being by yourself doesn't necessarily mean being lonely. There's a big difference. And I think that we all have to carve out space to have alone time, to be with yourself, to think about, what's important to you, those kinds of moments which define who you are. And I try to instill that in my daughter, that, when they're really small, they don't want to be alone. And you have to try to, it's almost like herding ducks or something. And you kind of have to keep them all in a row. And it's about kind of value of your own time, a certain kind of healthy selfishness. And I think that working in the studio, that for me and most of the artists that I know, that's the time that they really treasure the most. The time, when you hear an artist saying, "Oh man, I really got to get back to the studio," it's hopefully they're talking about that alone time, that moment where ideas sort of percolate and come to the surface, and that's kind of what that's about. I think it's really important to hold on to that.
So do you have a ritual of how you prepare to either enter the studio, or when you're in the studio, I'm sure some of the time is super productive, right? Maybe sometime is less productive. Is there a way that you navigate between the sort of active and passive types of creative working?
Yeah, I think that I don't physically have to be in the studio to be in the studio. I think there's a lot of time. I think it's really important and healthy to take time off from physically being in that room. And for me, I spent a lot of years having a living loft, and that romantic idea about the artist in the loft, and the leaky pipes and ceiling and stuff. And I did all of that. But the problem with that is that you wake up in the middle of the night to get yourself a glass of water or go to the bathroom, and you kind of walk past that painting, and then you find yourself sitting up at like 4 o'clock in the morning still working on the painting. And that's romantic and everything, but 9 times out of 10 you fuck up the painting. It's just, you really need to leave the studio and close the door, go home and be in your life. And I think that having a family, we were talking about our daughters with riding. I spend a lot of time with my daughter at the barn. And, I'm a kid, I was raised in New York City. Like, horses is the last thing that we knew. Horses was those little horse and buggy things around 59th Street that people hire during Christmas and do that whole thing. But I really love going to the barn, and it's amazing being in Los Angeles in this huge sprawling city, and I could be in traffic gnashing my teeth and then be over at the barn with San Gabriel Mountains around me and the smell of the barn around, and that it's really kind of amazing. And that is the same for me. I do that. I go with her over there. I watch her every step around the ring, but I'm still thinking about my process while I'm doing that. So I think that the physicality of being in the space doesn't necessarily have to define being in the studio.
It's so great because there are certain words that get put together and they evoke such a strong sensation, right? So, like investment bankers talk about the firm, right? And people who ride or have riders talk about the barn.
Sure.
And it's just a thing, right? Yeah. So it doesn't matter what barn it is, it's always the barn.
Yeah.
Right? So I love that you're talking about like being at the barn and watching your daughter in the ring and thinking about work too. Because sure. As you're saying that, I think about the barn, which is my daughter's first barn, which was in Aspen, and having her being in the ring. And for sure, I was thinking of essays I was, working on, or exhibitions I was curating, and being outside of the traditional workspace is often where you kind of release the pressure of creating, and then that's where you get the more flow of ideas.
Yeah, I mean, and that translates into other spaces. I mean, I'm from New York, and I'm just going to go on record as I've been a Laker fan since I was 3 years old. So, but I'm also a Knicks fan. And, I can remember, I've spent a lot of time in Madison Square Garden watching the Knicks. It's a miserable experience being a Knicks fan.
That is true.
And Robert Longo and I are very close, and we would go to Knicks games. And it's a very funny thing. Anybody that goes to those kind of sporting events will know what I'm talking about. But we'd be sitting there as close as we are together, and we're watching the game, and they're going up and down the court. And Robert and I are in this intense, geeked out conversation about materials and charcoal and paper and all these things. And all the folks around us are like, what the fuck are you guys talking about? The game is on, and you guys are talking about, what are you talking about, art or something, And those kinds of things were our moments of like artists just getting together, and whether it's a game, we were still keeping an eye on the game. Kind of knew the Knicks are losing the game, so it doesn't matter. But those are the type of moments that are outside of the studio, that you're still in the studio, and those are really valuable to be able to talk to another artist about those kinds of things. So, as much as the alone time is necessary, I also think that it's really important to stay connected to folks or other artists that you respect and hold dear to bounce ideas off of.
So to continue with the idea of art and sport for another bit, I was recently again at the Dallas Cowboy Stadium. I've been there a couple of times, and this last time I went for a game, but went early for an art tour. And Phil,
Phil.
who loves you, took us around, and I wanted to ask you to tell the story of creating the site-specific work that you did for the Dallas Cowboy Stadium. And then I'll tell you a little bit about Phil telling his side of the story.
That was for those of you who don't know, Heidi's talking about this collection at the new Dallas, well, it's not that new anymore, I guess, but the Dallas Cowboy Stadium has this incredible art collection. Jerry and Jeannie have this unbelievable, I can't even name off all the artists that are in that collection. But it's very big, ambitious work. And probably one of the best stories I can tell you out of that was going for a site visit. And I thought I was just going to meet somebody that was going to take us around. The stadium was still under construction. So I get out of this fancy car that they drove me from the airport, and I get out and I figure, a group of us are going to go around and see the thing. And I open the door, and there's Jerry Jones. And
who's the owner of the Dallas Cowboy Stadium?
Cowboys and
Dallas Cowboys, yes.
He's a very controversial figure. And there's a lot of people that don't like this guy. And, he's this blowhard and this and that and the other. And there's this perception of Jerry. And so we're walking around the stadium, and he's giving me the tour personally. And I'm sort of like, dude, don't you have something that you should be doing instead of taking an artist around the stadium? But the stadium is like his baby. And he was really careful to point out little things along the way. And we'd stop at certain points, like viewpoints, and he'd be showing me things. And he'd notice things like the plugs on the wall behind where the concessions are. And he'd start finding somebody that's like, hey, the plug covers aren't right here. And I'm like, Jesus Christ, Jerry Jones is worried about plug covers in the state. And I was like taking mental note. And I said, wow, this is fascinating to this guy. So at a certain point, he asked me if I was a Cowboy fan. And I was like, well, how do I answer this one? I'm really a Raider fan. But today I'm a Cowboy fan. And he laughed and whatnot. And there was this napkin on a table, and it had a Cowboy logo and star and whatnot. And I sort of referenced it, and I said, wow, it's a really nice graphic. And he said, you see this napkin? He apologized for owning his own plane. And I guess he thought that I was going to somehow read him on this environmental issue about his plane. But he said, Gary, one of the things that separates the Cowboys from the rest of these kinds of other teams is that I'm concerned with the design and how these napkins look when you're riding on my plane. You know that you're in a Dallas Cowboy airplane. And right there, I was like, wow, this guy, his attention to detail and his love for these things that he has this vision that's almost like very similar to the way an artist goes about producing a show or making their work, that he has this idea that if you're in and around his team, it has to look a very specific way. It's not a random choice. And he approves every little detail down to these napkins, and I was completely blown away. And we started to install down there, and for those of you who don't know, the piece that I did is probably about 70 or 75 feet long, and it's about 25 feet high, and it starts about 30 feet off the ground. So they had to build this wall of a scaffold, and I'm sort of up there. I'm afraid of heights, which is sort of weird. And I got all the way to the top, which is, probably, I don't know, about 50-something feet off the ground. And, for insurance reasons, I had to be strapped in and all of this stuff. And I can't get back from the wall. And at one point, I looked down 50 feet down, and there's Jerry and Cheney, watching every step of the way. And it was just really fascinating that this guy cared that much about his stadium. At a certain point, I actually unhooked myself from the thing and was, sort of jumping around. My work is very physical. So the idea of jumping around on a scaffold 50 feet in the air over Cowboy Stadium is pretty intense. But it was a very memorable installation.
Yeah, the piece is stunning. So the area that Gary described in terms of how big it is a really rich kind of blue with kind of some purple, and it creates this space that extends beyond your peripheral vision. So it fills everything that you can see, and then there's his characteristic white gestures, right? And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. But it's just a stunning piece, and it's definitely, I think, my favorite of all the works there. And there are incredible works by Dave Muller and Anish Kapoor and Doug Aiken and Yeppie Hine, and I mean, they're just amazing works,
yeah.
and they keep adding them. And I feel like your piece has the kind of physicality of something. I think that the physicality of the piece is so appropriate for a stadium where the idea is that people, they come together, right? They collide, and so that kind of explosiveness of the physicality of the interaction of football, I feel like, is really perfectly somehow balanced in the work.
Thank you. That's a really great compliment. I think that one of the things that I learned, I've been fortunate to have a lot of mentors and teachers in getting me to where I am. And one of the many was Robert Irwin. And I worked for Irwin on a big outdoor project. And actually, there's a funny story. I'll tell you the story really, really quickly. I was in art school, and there was this bulletin board, and it had, jobs and things, and it said, Robert Irwin. So I was like, wow, that's one of my favorite artists. I think I'll go see what this is about. So I get there, and there's a whole, almost like construction crew. And it was up near Riverdale in New York on the very west side. And we're digging. So he said, I got there, and he said, just grab a shovel and start digging. So I'm like, okay, this is Robert Irwin's thing, and I'm not going to ask any questions. And day after day goes by, and we're just digging this big giant hole. And guys keep disappearing. They don't come back the next day. And because it was sort of like a chain gang. It was like, you're just digging this hole for 8 hours a day. And so we were on a lunch break, and Robert looks at me and he says, hey, you. And I said, oh my God, what did I do? And he said, come over here and talk to me. And so I come over and I said, did I do something wrong? He's like, no, but you keep coming back. Everybody keeps disappearing and you keep coming back. Why is that? I was like, well, I'm a big fan of your work, and it's kind of important to me to learn from somebody like you. And he's talking and everything. And I said, can I ask you a question? What are we doing? So he said, well, we're actually digging. You're the first person to ask this question, first of all. And he said, he said, look around. And it's this incredible landscape. vista that I was looking at over the Hudson River and, you know, beautiful mountains on the other side. And he said, "You see that? You see that view?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You can't compete with that. There's no object, there's no thing that you could build or weld or construct or do whatever to compete with all of that. So what I want to do is change your perception. We're going to dig this ditch. I think it was 50 feet by 100 feet, and we're going to lower the earth 4 feet and have like this little step down into this area and line it with Core 10 steel. So it looks like the earth just basically dropped 4 feet. And it's going to change your perception of this landscape by 4 feet." And I was like, that's the greatest idea I ever heard when I was that young. Mm-hmm. And he said, he started to frame it in terms of painting. I was like, oh my God, this is like a mind-blowing day. So I was like, well, how is this painting? And he said, well, you know, I started off working like anyone else on an easel. And then I got off the easel and the canvas got a little bigger, and then soon I went to wall drawings, and then the wall drawings became too small, and then I started working out into the public. But I'm thinking about perception in the same way that you go about constructing a painting. And that conversation, which was probably 35 to 40 years ago, has left one of the most impressionable moments in my life. That an artist could teach you just in casual conversation and stay with you. And that, you know, watching Irwin, I was with him a number of other times at the Getty and other places where he had this vision of the garden 10 years out. And he did a show at MoCA, and I had to put a chair in the middle of this room in the museum and clear out all the art in that whole wing of the museum. You know what that's like. We cleared the entire wing. And there's this chair, and Robert comes in, you know, and he's very, you know, like he's very quiet. He's a sort of tall guy, not that tall, but he comes and he just sat there all afternoon. He probably sat there 6 hours, barely moved. He had a thing of water. And again, I had to, interrupt him, and I'm like, "Robert, what are we doing?" And he said, I'm preparing for a show that's coming up. And I said, "Wow, when's the show?" And he was like, "It's 6 years from now." So at that very moment, I realized, like, okay, this is like a different thing.
You make paintings, but you also make sculpture, and some of your sculptures incorporate painting. I would say the iconic way that you use chalk, right? And how you apply it, and then how you erase it. Can you describe that practice?
Sure. I think one of the things that I was referring to earlier is being lucky enough to work with a lot of people. Also, I went to some pretty great art schools. And I went to School of Visual Arts in Manhattan, and then I went to Cal Arts, and that was a really great balance, because at School of Visual Arts, you really were taught to just keep working, and the conceptual part will come to you. At Cal Arts, it was the opposite. You kind of think and then make, or you think, and then you scrap that idea and you start over again, and you do it that way. And I think that the coming together of those things was really important. But what I learned at Cal Arts was that, for me anyway, the material had to have a reason. So the chalkboard surface was a vehicle for not only a really sensuous sort of surface to draw on, but it also had a conceptual component. It was about pedagogy. It was about learning and teaching and memory and nostalgia and things like that. And that's what the chalkboard represented for me. And the chalk was really this way to put down a mark and physically, erase it. They're very physical. So that's where the sports thing comes back in. Mm-hmm. They're almost like action paintings or drawings. So it depends and it's dictated on my mood. So if I'm really angry, which my wife would say that I'm like that all the time, you know, it comes out in the drawing. If I'm tired or I'm not really feeling it, it comes out in the drawing. So chalk is a very it's a beautiful sort of material to work with because it moves across a surface, and with the wind or an erasure of my hand, it can just disappear. And that was what the idea was to put down a mark and erase it, but leave a trace behind. So it was all about kind of ghosts and trace, really. And chalk achieved that for me. It was almost like a memory of being in school and the teacher trying to erase yesterday's lesson, and it's still remaining. So he or she would be doing, a math problem, and you can still kind of faintly see yesterday's lesson underneath it, and those kinds of things come to mind, that kind of perception.
What makes you angry?
Wow, what makes me angry? That's a good question. I'm less angry since moving to California. I think New York, being born and raised in New York, it's like you're angry all the time. And I remember my wife is from New York too, and my daughter's born in New York. And it's funny because my daughter, as she goes through school, she keeps saying, Dad, kids out here, they don't get my humor. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, they're not like, it's really kind of, they don't get the kind of sharp humor. They think like I'm being angry or something. I was like, really? And the thing is I'm a West Indian descent. So like West Indians, we yell at each other all the time. Like we yell at each other to tell each other we love each other. So it's just like always, and it's so, like my wife will say, well, wow, you guys are so angry. It's like, no, actually, we're really telling each other how much we love each other. But there's this kind of, like, you got to fight for your moment to get a word in edgewise. And I think that comes across as kind of angry. And I think in New York, everything's a battle, It's, everything's a battle. Like whether you wake up, I remember when I decided to kind of move to California, and I have this routine that I do where I wake up, I'm the first one up, I wake up pretty early, I go to the bathroom to brush my teeth, I make the coffee, and by the time I come back from brushing my teeth and everything, the coffee's made, so make it, bring it to my wife in bed, she loves that. And I'd be like in a whole thing by the time I got the coffee in my hand. She's like, what are you pissed off about now? Like, how could you possibly be angry between here, the bathroom, the coffee, and back here? And I'm like, I don't know, that fucking thing outside, and there's just this tension that's always around you. And I looked at her and I said, we don't have to live like this. This is ridiculous. Like, you don't have to. I think when you're younger, that kind of energy, you kind of live off of it, you kind of thrive off of it in a weird way. I think walking around the streets of New York, just the kind of inherent sort of potential for violence that's about to break out. And then I don't mean like fights or muggings or that kind of violence. I mean, there's always like something that is that you have to be aware of. Whether it's the thing that's happening up the street and you kind of have to pay attention to that and cross the street. Like you're always kind of navigating the streets. And I think you sort of live off of that. Like the greasy burgers being made that's blowing in your face or, the garbage that's piled up over here. All of that stuff is kind of like a turn on. And you're going to the studio and one of the cool things is that between my apartment and getting to the studio, I could meet probably 10 different people. I'll have coffee. I'll go into a hardware store and pick up some weird object. And then by the time I get to the studio, I've already had all these interactions. LA is different. You get in your car. It's hot as hell outside, so you put on your air conditioning. I put on the music. It's my music. Nobody else can hear it. And, by the time I get there, the thinking process is different because I think that my time between the house and the studio is a lot of alone time. Again, it's back to that, and I can think through my day in a much more healthier, selfish sort of way. Whereas New York, you're kind of navigating, you're fighting to get there, and then once you get there, you're like, Jesus Christ, I'm here. All right, well, what do I got to do? I got to make the most of my time. So it's a very different kind of time management thing. And so I guess to answer your question, I think that I used to really love living off of that kind of inherent anger and rage on the streets in New York. And now I'm far more interested in like kind of going to the barn.
When you're erasing, I guess, and you talked about how your mood or your energy affected the kind of speed or the effort of that gesture, does that impact the subject matter too?
Yes. I think from early on, it definitely did. I mean, I think that the work really started where I was, I'll try to compress the story. I was working and trying to work on a film. And everything that I do generally starts with film, both as a source to research an idea. I'll go through and see if there's a film that has dealt with that. And so I go through, recently I went through a lot of like silent films and stills and things like that. So I kind of got off menu a little.
I was asking you about how if
the speed of it and how it's affecting. I think that through researching different cartoons, early cartoons in the 30s and 40s, I was using a lot of like race cartoons, those kinds of things where it dealt with racial stereotypes and things like that. And I think that there was, that anger, rage thing comes back because drawing, I would draw these images on the chalkboard, and then, the attempt to erase the stereotype was really what the erasure drawings were about. So I think that urgency to obliterate the image was really impacted by the speed and that kind of thing, and it's a sort of futile thing because there's still traces of it left behind, which is true to actually life. I mean, I think those traces still exist.
Yeah, I was thinking about how you use the words trace and ghost sort of simultaneously and almost like in parallel or in balance. And in a way, I guess if you use them in aesthetic terms, they can be the same. But I think they can also be really different.
Oh, I think they're very different.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, what do you think about the ghost, right? Like of the, it's not necessarily the ghost of the image, but the ghost of history or the ghost of the past or, how present does it feel for you now, I guess?
It feels very present now.
Okay.
I think in the political climate we're in, it feels very present now. I think that, ghosts and traces are two different things. I think that, it's almost like if you want to talk about haunting, I think that something can haunt you
good.
In a way. Haunting can be something that's positive as well as negative. Whereas a trace, if I have a cologne on or you have a perfume on or what have you, or any kind of bath scent or something, and you walk through this room, there's a trace left behind. There's, one of the things I was watching something the other night where somebody's their partner passed away, and they were frantically trying to, get this scent from a sweater that person was wearing, and there's this need to kind of recall memory through that trace, that scent, because it sort of lingers and it stays in your memory, and you almost, it's like I can still remember the scent of my grandmother. It's a very specific thing that triggers memory. To be haunted is a different thing. I think that the things that activate a haunt are totally different, and I think to be haunted by racial stereotypes or negative imagery, things like that, are things that keep coming back to you in a very different way. They're not. You don't hold on to them in the same exact way. I also think that something that haunts you in a positive way is a very interesting thing too. Case in point, I mean, I have, Jack Whitten was really important to me as a teacher, and then we ended up teaching together and became very close friends. And Jack haunts my studio from time to time. I can hear him he's, we have conversations when I'm there, and I'll be working, and it's like, what, that kind of thing, where it feels like he's literally in the room. So I think that the haunting is very different than traces. Yes, I do use them.
Yeah, I love the word haunting, and I love that idea. And I think I personally can, I guess, be haunted by people who are still living also, right?
Sure.
But yes, when someone who, I love, who's no longer here, when I can hear that voice in my head, or a laugh, or, it's incredible company.
Yeah. Or, those moments where you say, wow, I wish so-and-so was here with me to experience that, because he or she would really appreciate that thing. Or, and yeah, I mean, there's times where I literally have conversations with my wife, and she is here. I'll be in New York, and I'll be somewhere, and they'll be out of, I don't know, everything bagels, and it's just like, oh my God, and I'm having a conversation with my wife, and I can call her, and I said, yeah, we had that conversation today. She's like, yeah. So one of the things that I have talked about a lot is that the fact that art can keep you company, and so that is kind of evoked for me with that idea of, conversations with people alive or not. But do you feel like that? Do you feel like you have conversations with works of art? Do you feel like they keep you company? My own or other?
Both.
Yeah, I think when your work is clicking, you're in that zone, and it's to use a sports analogy, it's almost like when a basketball player is just hitting 3-pointers, and it's like the basket's as big as a swimming pool, and they just keep firing, and it just keeps going in, and then there's other times where you just can't get it to go, and you're working in the studio, and the painting is just like, it's not. I have battles with paintings, and I'll walk away from it. I tend to leave things that are irritating me or that I hate around all the time, because I need to keep it on the wall and walk past it. And it might take up to a year before I figure it out, and then I'll get back to it. There you are, And so there is a constant kind of conversation. And I think some of the best work of other people that you come across, it doesn't happen all the time, but it's when it happens, it's amazing when somebody else's work is talking to you. And I think one of the best compliments that you can ever give another artist is to say, God damn, I wish I made that, or I wish I thought about that. And there are artists that I know, I can go to their shows and I walk in and go, fuck, man, I wish I thought of that. That's such a good idea. And I love that. I love that moment of walking into someone else's show and having that.
Do you have an example you could share of that?
Oh my God, David Hammond's entire body of work.
Right.
You know, David Hammond does it for me. Chris Burden was one. You know, Chris was one of those. If you were coming up with an idea, you better check the catalog to make sure Chris didn't make it already. You know, Jessica Stockholder is, I love, the funny thing about Jessica Stockholder, when I first started looking at Jessica Stockholder's work, I hated it. I absolutely hated it. And I would sit and argue with you for probably 2 hours about how horrible Jessica Stockholder is. And then it occurred to me, I was like, wow, you know, you're really passionate about hating this work. Maybe you actually like it, you know? And so I started looking at it and I was like, fuck, she's brilliant. She's so good. I mean, the things that she does and where she's taking painting is just, you know, I don't know anybody that's taking painting to that next place the way Stockholder does. I think she's amazing.
It's so interesting because that work really annoyed me at first too.
Yeah.
Because I was like, I don't
irritating.
get it. Like, what is it doing? Like, why? Like, why is it doing that?
What's that fan
exactly.
thing? You know, and the
why,
little
like,
piece of whatever. It's like I would just want to kick it or something. And then you're like, wow, this is really poetic and beautiful and like delicate,
subtle,
and lovely. And,
yes,
you know, you're just
sly.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
And then you start looking at it like the perspective and the way she's putting objects together. And yeah, I could go on forever about Jessica Stockholder. She's amazing.
Yeah, it's so interesting though, right? I felt like she was trying to make me feel dumb. And it's like, oh no, I just am being dumb, right?
But for sure I was. You know, I didn't get it.
When you can't sleep at night, what are you thinking about?
Oh, wow. Well, first of all, I'm an insomniac, so I don't sleep very often at all. Work-wise, it can be any number of things. This is a tough question, actually. What keeps me up at night? Trying to figure out a 13-year-old. That'll keep you up at night. You know, that's a good one. I think, you know, it's the reason why I said I can't live in a living loft anymore, because I get obsessed about things, and so I'm obsessive, and you know, and I have this need to get things in order or right within the work. And when it's not clicking, that'll keep me up at night.
So when did you know that you wanted to be an artist?
That's a good question. I think that, you know, my mother, if she was here, she would tell you, you know, I was that little kid that would sit behind the sofa and draw on the walls. And my parents would discover it, and they'd be like, oh my God, he's drawing all over the walls again. And I was lucky enough that my parents, would say, you know what, just let him go. We can paint the wall. It's not a big deal. Just let him do his thing. So the funny part about that is, and when I talk to my parents, you know, they bring that up, and they're like, you know, it's really funny that we used to let you draw all over the walls, and now you get paid to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think that, you know, the two things that I really loved the most was hitting, you know, a 95-mile-an-hour fastball and drawing. That was like the two things that I loved. At the end of the day, I could do that all day long. And I think when I got hurt and I couldn't move on with playing ball, it was an obvious choice. There was a moment that somebody sort of pushed me in the right direction. I used to work in a body shop, and I did these like murals. I don't know if people remember this, but like in the 70s and 80s, it was popular to customize vans and cars and stuff, that Pimp My Ride thing that they have a television show on. So we used to, you know, do custom cars. And I would sweep the floor, and then on my breaks, I'd smoke a cigarette and go out in the back and do these murals on these bits of the cars. And the owner comes back, and he said, what are you doing back here? And he looked at all these fenders with all these murals on them. And he was like, wow, these are really good. And so I was like, yeah, man, I told you this is what I want to do. And so he gave me a shot. And the first time I did it was this big, huge biker all tatted up and, patch on the back, like classic stereotypical biker. And so I do the tank. He loves it. He's like, I'm going to bring my bros back. He gives me this big bag of pot and like a case of beer. And when you're 17, that's like the greatest thing in the world. So I thought, wow, this is it. This is what I want to do. So the owner's like, well, we were sitting down one day and he said, Gary, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, I think I'm going to open up my custom shop and do this, and this is what I want. And he was like, that's a terrible idea. And I was like, why? Is it, is it some, you don't want me to, like the competition? Right. You do not want this thing? He's like, no, you're way too good for this shit. This is nonsense. I'll tell you what, you should go to art school. So if you go to art school and finish art school and come out and you still want to do this, I'll open the shop with you. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. And I never looked back. And that guy probably actually pushed me over the edge to get to art school. And that's how I got to art school.
So we haven't really talked about music. You referenced it when you said that's one of the things you like about LA is it's your music and no one else can hear it.
Yeah.
So that implied like a certain volume potentially to it.
Yeah.
And the boombox, I guess, is an iconic element in your work. You've used it a lot, quiet and loud.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Music, you talked about, sort of rituals when you start the day in the studio, and I think that music is a huge part of being in the studio. And I think that for me, that's probably the first thing I do. Like if you ask me what I did this morning, first thing I do is I walk in, I turn the lights on, and I figure out what music I'm going to play. And it ranges. I used to DJ. And I really enjoyed that. And so even, that was like a kind of aesthetic experience of digging. The thing about being a DJ, and I compare it to being an artist because I think of myself more as like a visual DJ, because you're taking images from two different places and remixing them and kind of almost creating a hybrid. And I think a DJ does the same thing. A really good DJ, not like a button pushing DJ, that's not a DJ. When you have like two turntables and you're mixing vinyl, and that guy or woman is thinking, 3 or 4 records down the road. So by the time you figure out that this is, ABC from the Jackson 5, I'm already on to like 3 or 4 songs down the way, and you're basically implanting music and sounds and different break beats into somebody's head, and that's how you keep the floor moving, is by keeping that. And so you're thinking, when you see him or her with the headphones and they're holding that, they're listening to so much music in their ear and they're watching the crowd. It's a lot like making art. I think that for me, I take images from a car commercial or a sporting event or the way things move. I'll be at the zoo, I'll look at the way animals are moving, things like that, and that trace, that gesture finds its way into the work. So I think that music for me is a really big part of the day. So I can start with Miles Davis and then end up with like the Stranglers at the end of the day. It goes all over the place. So if I'm in a really kind of, I gotta, just hit things and, I gotta do a lot of hammering that day, I'm probably listening to a lot of punk rock. So, 70s punk rock is right there. I'll listen to The Clash, I'll listen to The Stranglers, I'll listen to, Cherry Vanilla. Hip hop is really important for me. I think that early and golden era hip hop is something that's been close. I knew a lot of rappers and had a lot of friends that were, in that scene. So that's very important. I think jazz is enormous. I was just hanging out with Jason Moran, and we were talking about like obscure. One of the things that I loved about Mike Kelly was not only was he a great artist, but his catalog for music was unmatched. And the times that I remember talking to Mike the most was about music. And we could go on like two geeks in a record store talking about album covers and sleeves of albums and the smell of the way that you when you take a record out. Those kinds of memorable things come into play when you're making work. So I think music's a really important. Plus, that's who's with you when you're alone in the studio is your music. It's you and your music.
I think there's something about DJing, right, and listening to what's happening, but also planning ahead. Mm-hmm. And then also what you're talking about with Robert Irwin and his planning. And so I'm curious about if you future think.
Oh, yeah, you have to. I mean, yeah. I think that's probably that's the one thing nobody teaches you in art school, is future thinking. I like that phrase. I'll make the comparison again to music. I mean, it's, when a band comes out or a group comes out, they've been working on that record for as long as they've been together. It might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, who knows, I don't know. But they finally get it together, they produce that record. The second record is a little different because the time compression, the need by the record company to put that record out is compressed. So now your choices of play are very different. And I think that making art is a similar thing. When you're in art school, you're working on these ideas, and finally you hit on one, and you come out, and maybe it hits, maybe it misses, I don't know. But building up to that, that's nothing. Like, you got to think about the 5th show, the 8th show, the 9th show. And nobody tells you about that part. Nobody tells you that you have to be thinking about shows 2 years ahead while you're sitting in an airplane at the gate waiting to get back home, and you're exhausted and tired and whatever. But it's like, oh dear God, so where's this show going? Where's this going? And how do I get to this place? You have to kind of forward think in a way, in spaces that aren't necessarily in the comfort of your studio. And I think that that's important for a younger artist to know. There's a lot of work that I haven't gotten to yet that's still in the percolating part of my brain.
Just tease one thing.
Interestingly enough, some of the new work that I'm working on now was born out of I'm putting together a very large traveling survey, which has been a really interesting experience because I've always watched other people put together a survey. And, Mike, since we talked about Mike, I remember the first time Mike did his survey show at the Whitney, and it paralyzed him. He couldn't work for a really long period of time. He couldn't work. And I think that the idea of a retrospective kind of can freeze you, and you don't know what to do after. It's like, well, now where do I go? What do I do? I mean, do I stop? Do I just move to, Bali or something and surf for the rest of my life? What do I do? And I think you can't look at it that way. I think you have to keep moving. And this show, I'm putting together a show for New York, and a lot of, well, let me say it this way. I think that when you're a young artist, you're trying to make really big gestures. So you're coming out, you don't know how many shows you're going to get. This might be the only show you ever get, or there might be 3 or 4 shows that you get. So each show has to be big, and it needs to make a statement, and it needs to, make some noise. And I think what happens in that is that you don't often have the luxury of working completely through an idea and then move on. Like you kind of have to go out and make that big blast and then come out with another big blast. It's almost like a boxing match. You want to throw some haymakers. And I started realizing that there were bodies of work, images that I hadn't completely. I'm not done with those, and they're like old friends or something that I still haven't worked through those friendships or something. And so a lot of the work that, as I've come more comfortable with painting and the act of painting and application and surface and building that, some of the images are reminiscent of some of the earlier cartoon pieces and things like that. They've found their way back into the vernacular. So it's a very interesting thing to actually see them kind of come to the surface like a photograph. It's almost like, whoop, oh, there you are, and they feel just as fresh, even and more relevant, 25 or 30 years later than when I first started with them.
Nice. I love that idea of when you first start out that you just don't know how many chances you're going to get or how much time you have, and that, at some unknown point in the future, if you're lucky enough, right, then you get to kind of start referring back to where you came from. Yeah. So.
I mean, that's the first thing I do. That's the other thing that I do when I walk in the door is I'm super thankful to be able to do what it is I do. I mean, I'm one of those lucky people that I walk in the studio and I could choose to work or I could not work, or I'm on my own time, and it's what I love to do. That is more powerful than any amount of money that you could give somebody to have the opportunity to just do what you care about so much, and make a living from it. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I love the idea of ending on the notion of freedom and gratitude.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Conversations About Art is part of Heidi.art. This episode was recorded live in front of an audience at Spring Place, Beverly Hills, as part of a program partnership between Heidi Zuckerman and Spring Place. Thanks to Lauren Taylor and Katya Kazia. Simon Illa is our producer. Sound recording of this episode was done by Kevin Arguello. Blake Migdon helped with social media. Our theme music was composed by Eric McDougall. Jordan Weisberg is our curatorial associate. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and review us on whichever platform you listened, as it helps us further our goal of connecting all to art. We will be back again every other Tuesday with new episodes. Thanks for listening.